There are plenty of horror veterans who wouldn't bat an eyelid while watching slashers, zomcoms, or paranormal thrillers, and yet they might draw the line when it comes to body horror. After all, seeing human bodies mutating, meshing together, or being mutilated is pretty screwed up. Seriously, who wasn't scarred for life after watching The Fly? For this reason, sickly flicks like these tend to be a niche market. That's why it was jarring but refreshing to see a splatter-heavy gorefest like The Substance recently picking up quite a few gongs. For the first time in a while, casual moviegoers are talking about arguably the most disgusting subgenre out there. So while body horror is enjoying the spotlight, now seems like the perfect time to reflect on films of that ilk that never got their due. Before we continue, we must lay out a word of caution. Some of the entries on this list are in their own league of disturbing. Though these 10 films are worth checking out, don't say we didn't warn you. I'm Sean Ferrick for What Culture Horror, and here are 10 hidden gem body horror movies. Number 10, Shivers. David Cronenberg is directly responsible for popularizing body horror. As a result, it's fitting to kick off our list with his first dip into the genre. Shivers revolves around a scientist who hopes to revolutionize the medical field by creating parasites that can perform the functions of human organs. However, society soon descends into chaos when the donors begin infecting everyone around them with a parasite. While watching Shivers, it's obvious Cronenberg was still finding his footing, and yet the underrated skin crawler holds up. Even after half a century, due to the shoestring budget, reported to be under $200,000 at the time, gore is limited and the invasive worms never appear for long. Although this would have spelt disaster for an amateur director, Cronenberg took the Jaws approach, focusing more on atmosphere and building up the slimy critters as much as possible. Shivers is ultimately a body horror, but it effectively mixes in a few zombie elements. While the infected are chasing their victims in droves, you'd swear you were watching a George A. Romero flick. Considering the influence Cronenberg's body horror has had on the genre, it's worth checking out the film that started it all. Number 9. Excision. Adapted from the short film of the same name, Excision serves as Richard Bates Jr.'s feature-length directorial debut. This mega-dark comedy follows a delusional teen called Pauline, played by Annalyn McCord, who can't stop having sexual fantasies including blood and dissection. After learning her sister needs a lung transplant, Pauline vows to take control of her life, which leads to disaster. McCord is astounding as Pauline, playing the dysfunctional lead so awkwardly you permanently feel uncomfortable watching her. And yet McCord conveys teen angst effortlessly, making the deeply disturbed character easy to connect with. Interestingly, 95% of the body horror occurs in Pauline's unhinged mind. As such, the plot could function without these what the images. However, these moments never come across as superfluous, since they help us to understand why Pauline is the way she is. She's not lashing out for attention, she's literally broken. After gaining tremendous insight into Pauline's warped psyche, it's easier to empathize with her, even when she performs lewd and sickening acts. Number 8. Huesera, the Bone Woman. In this Mexican-Peruvian horror, a woodworker called Valeria is over the moon when she falls pregnant. But after being cursed by an unseen spirit, Valeria notices her friends and family are avoiding her. Unable to cope, the mother-to-be takes desperate measures to rectify the situation. Even though body horror is associated with blood and guts, Huesera puts more focus on bones. Though there is traditional gore to be had, the spooky folktale doesn't emphasize it. Instead, the demonic force makes itself known with the cracking of bones. The constant grinding and popping makes Huesera the Bone Woman unbearable to watch and listen to, even when there's nothing conventionally scary on screen. The literal bone chiller doesn't have much in-your-face violence, so it doesn't rely on jump scares, which is refreshing. Despite the outlandish premise, Huesera the Bone Woman is surprisingly relatable, since it highlights the insecurities and hardships new parents must endure. The supernatural elements literally pop in when Valeria is at her most vulnerable, amplifying the scare factor exponentially. Huesera the Bone Woman's creative concept leaves such a deep impression, it'll deter anyone from cracking their knuckles for a long time. Number 7. Swallow. Not to be mixed up with the 2022 body horror Swallowed, Swallow follows a pregnant housewife called Hunter, who suddenly develops a very real disorder called pica, compelling her to eat inedible objects. Despite causing damage to her body and jeopardizing her relationship with her husband, Hunter can't stop eating marbles, paper clips, chess pieces, mud, and batteries. Even though pica is extremely rare, it's easy to empathize with Hunter. While she gazes at the ice in her glass, it glistens and swirls in an alluring way, almost like it's begging to be eaten. By making non-foods like this look enticing, it's understandable why Hunter can't control herself. The editing and camera angles become erratic when Hunter suppresses her compulsion, so she's depicted as a prisoner in her own body. And with her husband and family constantly down her throat, she feels like a prisoner in her own home. This magnifies Hunter's condition since she believes embracing her pica is the only way she can stay in control. Rather than pushing the body horror, Swallow focuses on the mental side of Hunter's obsession. She understands her problem lies deep within and she must face it to stop her disorder from consuming her entirely. Swallow mightn't play out like a conventional horror, but it's sure to leave anyone unnerved nonetheless. Number 6. Birth, Rebirth. Laura Moss's contemporary Frankenstein earned a pittance at the box office, despite being one of the most imaginative and messed up stories inspired by Mary Shelley's cautionary tale. When a nurse called Celie, played by Scrubs' Judy Reyes, learns her daughter Lila, played by AJ Lister, has died in hospital, she follows the child's doctor, Rose Casper, played by Maren Ireland, certain she's hiding something. After storming into Rose's apartment, Celie sees Lila has been reanimated, but barely clinging to life. When Rose informs Celie that she can rejuvenate Lila by harvesting the bodies of pregnant women, the desperate mother questions how far she'll go to keep her child alive. Though the premise and graphic scenes are sick and twisted, it's the conviction of the two leads that makes Birth, Rebirth work so well. Maren Ireland plays Rose like she wants to better the world, so her motivation is understandable despite her questionable methods. Judy Reyes knocks it out of the park, playing a mother who will stop at nothing to do what's right for her daughter. Birth, Rebirth may have gone under the radar, but it has all the signs of a future cult classic. Number 5. Starry Eyes. Like The Substance, Starry Eyes focuses on an actress called Sarah who's willing to give up her life for fame and fortune. Also like The Substance, the Kickstarter-funded feature feels more like a psychological drama until the third act, when it abruptly transforms into a full-blown body horror. Also, it saves the biggest nightmare fuel for the end. Speaking of which, it might be wise to give Starry Eyes a miss if maggots freak you out. It may not be on par with Demi Moore's vicious satire, but Starry Eyes shouldn't be discounted. Thanks to the tightly written script and solid performances, the most flawed characters come across as real people rather than caricatures. With that said, Starry Eyes knows when to lay it on thick. The showbiz characters are so reprehensible, it's heart-wrenching to watch them degrade Sarah, especially when she bares her soul to them during the auditions and interviews. What's worse is how the film realistically shows how the industry plays with the victims' insecurities, compelling them to destroy themselves in the hopes of achieving their dreams. Even though Be Careful What You Wish For stories have been done to death, Starry Eyes explores the idea in a fresh and new way. Number 4. In My Skin. The new French extremity horror opens with a marketing professional called Esther, portrayed by the director and writer Marina Divan, cutting her leg at a house party. Esther becomes entranced by her wound, endlessly picking and scratching at it. She can't go more than a minute without burrowing into her own flesh, even when she's talking to friends or sleeping with her husband. What makes Esther's predicament so depressing is there's no real cause for it. As far as we know, she was a normal person with no history of trauma, mental illness or OCD, and yet one cut on her leg inexplicably sent her over the edge. Also, Esther isn't really to blame, since she tries to suppress her detrimental impulses. Unfortunately, she finds herself unable to function, unless she embraces her newly awakened fetish. In My Skin isn't as revolting as the other entries on this list, but it's still a tough watch. Number 3. Brain Damage. Although Frank Henenlotter's Frankenhooker and Basket Case trilogy developed cult followings, Brain Damage never garnered the same audience. This is a shame since it's arguably Henenlotter's best film. The comedic creature feature centers around a relatively ordinary man called Brian, whose life turns upside down when a brain-eating parasite fuses to his spine. Rather than sucking Brian's skull dry, Aylmer overloads his host's cerebral cortex with endorphins, causing him to experience pure happiness. Aylmer promises to let Brian experience his nirvana state again if he finds victims for him to snack on. Considering the antagonist is a goofy-looking alien with a silly voice, it goes without saying that Brain Damage doesn't take itself too seriously. Having said that, the 80s gem is surprisingly effective at portraying mature themes, including drug addiction, loss of control, and self-destructive cravings. Though Brian rejects Aylmer's nefarious scheme at first, he changes his tune when the lack of endorphins causes him to hallucinate. The withdrawal gets so bad, Brian begins to imagine his organs are falling out and blood is gushing from his head. Unable to cope with the pain, Brian begs Aylmer to take control of his mind willingly, turning himself into a murderous junkie once again. Even though Brain Damage could have been a forgettable B-movie, moments like this really elevate the material. Number 2. The Eyes of My Mother. Despite the 72-minute runtime, The Eyes of My Mother contains enough haunting visuals to rattle anyone. In the beginning of Nicholas Pace's black and white indie, we're introduced to a girl called Francisca, who's been conditioned by her mother to remain unfazed by death. When the mother is butchered by a deranged salesman called Charlie, Francisca decides to care for her mother's killer, seeing him as her only friend. Though Francisca behaves unrealistically merciful at first, Charlie quickly finds himself praying for death. It's impossible not to initially sympathize for Francisca, since she bared witness to an unspeakable tragedy at the hands of a maniac. But over time, it's apparent Franziska's grief has awakened a dark side inside her, which is a truly terrifying thing to behold. Although body horrors tend to over-stylize the bloodshed, it's deliberately understated here. However, this decision makes the violent parts more intense, since they feel raw and authentic. Though Franziska becomes arguably more monstrous than the man who took her mother's life, the actresses portraying her do a phenomenal job at depicting her as a tragic figure, which makes the story significantly more horrifying. Number 1. The Skin I Live In. Pedro Almodovar's The Skin I Live In centers around a visionary surgeon called Robert Ledgard, played by Antonio Banderas, who hopes to create synthetic skin that's resistant to fire and cuts. After the death of his wife and daughter, Ledgard buries himself in his work, desperate to find purpose in life. When he starts performing his experimental procedures on a mysterious woman called Vera, played by Elena Anaya, against her will, he seems to have all the hallmarks of a mad scientist. But as the plot unfolds, it becomes clear that nothing is as black and white as it seems. The Skin I Live In explores a myriad of themes, including sexual identity, obsession, unresolved grief, sexual violence, suicide, and legacy. Although an inexperienced filmmaker would struggle to balance so many ideas, Almodovar pulls it off with flying colours. Banderas finds the humanity in Ledgard, so the dastardly doctor comes across as a three-dimensional character rather than a cartoonish villain. Due to this premise, it goes without saying this existential thriller has plenty of unsettling imagery. However, it's the story itself that's sure to leave everybody squirming, and when the truth is finally revealed about Vera and Ledgard's relationship, nightmares are pretty much guaranteed.